The night air over London hangs heavy with mist, the kind that blurs the line between stone and shadow. Torches flicker along the battlements of the tower, their light swallowed by the black waters of the Thames below. Inside these walls, silence reigns. Not the peaceful silence of sleep, but the kind that weighs on the chest like a stone. Somewhere deep in the fortress, two boys lie awake. The elder, barely 9 years old, stares at the ceiling, his thoughts a storm of fear and confusion. He is a king. At least, he was crowned as one. Yet tonight, he is little more than a prisoner. His younger brother, only 12 months behind him in age, curls closer, whispering questions the elder cannot answer. Why have their attendants been dismissed? Why do their guards never smile? Why are the windows locked? Outside the tower, the streets of London buzz with rumors. Some whisper that the boys are being kept safe until their coronation. Others mutter darker things, that the crown no longer belongs to the boy called Edward V, but to his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, a man whose ambition casts a shadow longer than the tower itself. In the years to come, poets, chroniclers, and kings would argue over what happened in those chambers. Some would claim the boys were murdered in silence, their small bodies buried beneath stone steps. Others would insist they lived on, smuggled abroad, their true fate hidden beneath layers of lies. But in the summer of 1483, one thing became certain. England's child king, Edward V, vanished from history. And in that vanishing, he became immortal, a symbol of innocence crushed beneath the iron weight of power. His short reign, his mysterious death, and the conspiracy that followed would echo for centuries, haunting the English crown like a curse. This is his story, the boy who was king, the brother who stood beside him, and the night when both disappeared into legend. Imagine being born into a kingdom where thrones were not inherited but stolen, where kings rose and fell as swiftly as dice on a gaming table. Edward of York, the boy who would become Edward V, opened his eyes to such a world on November 2, 1470, in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. His birth was no peaceful event, no celebration filled with certainty. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had sought refuge in the abbey while her husband, King Edward IV, was driven from the throne by his enemies. The child who entered the world in those shadowed chambers was born a fugitive, a prince without a crown. But fate is nothing if not cruelly ironic. Only months later, Edward IV reclaimed his throne through steel and blood, cutting down his rivals in the Wars of the Roses. His infant son, born under the dark canopy of exile, was suddenly transformed into England's most precious treasure, heir to the throne. The bells of London tolled in triumph, and the boy's name was carried on the lips of nobles and commoners alike. From the very beginning, Edward was raised not just as a child, but as a weapon. His tutors drilled him in Latin, law, and the delicate dance of diplomacy. He was taught to hold his back straight, to measure his words, to wear a crown in the way only sons of kings could. Yet behind the lessons and the pageantry, the boy was still a child. He laughed with his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, and played games in the gardens of Ludlow Castle. To him, kingship was a dream painted in bright colors. Battles won, feasts held, banners fluttering in the wind. But those around him knew better. Edward IV, though a towering and charismatic king, was surrounded by enemies. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had offended England's proud nobility. She was no foreign princess, but the widow of a mere knight, a commoner in royal eyes. Worse still, the Woodvilles, her ambitious family, used the marriage to claw their way into the highest offices of the realm. Old blood despised them, and hatred simmered beneath every smile at court. Edward V's childhood was therefore gilded but fragile. He was surrounded by tutors, soldiers, and priests who reminded him that he was not simply a boy, but the future of the House of York, a fragile dynasty that rested on the ruins of civil war. He was paraded through towns, dressed in silks and crowned with laurels, shown to the people as the bright future of England. Crowds cheered, banners waved, but the whispers never faded, whispers that a boy king was a dangerous thing in a land where steel ruled more often than blood. Even Edward's closest family were shadows of conflict. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, served his brother the king with icy loyalty, but beneath that loyalty lay an ambition sharpened by years of war. Edward's half-brothers, born from his father's earlier liaisons, were already being maneuvered into positions of power. And then there were the exiled Lancastrian claimants, watching from across the Channel, waiting for Yorkist weakness. The boy's education may have been full of books and prayers, but his true lessons came from the stories whispered by soldiers and courtiers. Kings betrayed, heirs murdered, dynasties toppled. He grew up knowing that his blood was both crown and curse. He could inherit a throne or be strangled by it. So when the boy was just 12 years old, and his father suddenly collapsed in the spring of 1483, Edward was not simply left without a parent. He was left standing on the very edge of a cliff, the crown glittering in the abyss below. The spring of 1483 began with blossoms in London, but within the walls of Westminster, a chill colder than winter took hold. King Edward IV, the man who had restored the House of York and ruled England with towering strength, fell ill. At first, the court dismissed it as another bout of fever. The king was only 40, broad-shouldered and larger than life, a warrior who had crushed his rivals at Towton and Barnet. Surely, they said, he would recover. But as the days passed, the king's color drained, his breath grew shallow, and whispers swept through the palace like smoke. On April 9th, Edward IV breathed his last. His once mighty body lay still, and with it the kingdom trembled. His heir, Prince Edward, was only 12 years old, too young to rule alone, too fragile to stand against the storm that was already brewing. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, England faced the prospect of a boy king, a prospect that sent daggers of ambition flashing through every noble heart. The Woodvilles, Queen Elizabeth's family, wasted no time. They seized control of the royal treasury, gathered the boy's household, and prepared to escort him from Ludlow Castle, where he had been raised, to London for his coronation. Their plan was simple: place the crown quickly upon Edward's head, surround him with loyal men, and ensure that the Woodvilles held the strings of power during his minority. But there was another player on the board, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's youngest brother. A seasoned commander, cold-eyed and relentless, Richard had been loyal to Edward IV in life. Now, as Lord Protector named in his brother's will, he claimed the right to guide the young king until he came of age. To Richard, the Woodvilles, haste was not loyalty but usurpation, their grip on the boy not guardianship but ambition. In May of 1483, the two factions moved like rival armies converging on the same prize. Edward V, riding at the head of a glittering procession from Ludlow, expected only ceremony and cheers. Instead, he found his uncle Richard waiting on the road at Stony Stratford. Smiling with one hand, seizing with the other, Richard arrested Edward's Woodville guardians, accusing them of treason. The boy himself was treated with courtesy, but courtesy wrapped in chains of velvet. From that moment, the young king's fate was no longer his own. Richard escorted him to London, the crowd still cheering, but beneath the acclamations lay unease. The boy rode through the city gates, hailed as Edward V, King of England. Yet beside him, ever watchful, ever commanding, rode the Duke of Gloucester. Plans for the coronation proceeded. Dates were set, ceremonies rehearsed. But behind the closed doors of Westminster, Richard moved swiftly. The Woodvilles were pushed aside. The boy's mother, Elizabeth, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children, fearing the storm, and whispers began to spread. Whispers that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had never been valid, that their children were illegitimate, that the crown did not belong to Edward V at all. The boy himself could not know the depth of the currents pulling beneath his feet. He still wrote polite letters, still dreamed of the crown his tutors told him was his by right, but each day his circle grew smaller, his attendants dismissed, his freedom curtailed. And by June, Edward V was moved, not to Westminster for his coronation, but to the Tower of London. Officially, it was tradition. Kings had long stayed in the Tower before their crowning, but the crowds that watched him pass through its gates felt a chill, as though they had seen a bright flame swallowed by stone. A coronation was promised, yet none would ever come. The boy was told he was safe, that the Tower of London was no prison but a palace, a royal residence where kings had always stayed before their coronations. Yet stone walls do not comfort a child who hears the locks click shut behind him. Edward V entered the fortress in early May 1483, still unaware of the storm gathering around his head. He was joined shortly after by his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, only 11 years old. The sight of the two princes together reassured the people. Surely, they said, Gloucester meant no harm. He was their uncle, their protector, entrusted by the dying king to guard his heirs. The coronation would go on. The boy would be crowned. But outside those walls, the protector's mask began to slip. Richard of Gloucester moved swiftly, like a chess master eliminating every piece that threatened his path. He spread whispers that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was unlawful, that he had been pre-contracted to another woman before Elizabeth. If true, it meant the princes were illegitimate, bastards unfit to wear the crown. It was a dagger of rumor sharpened into law. Parliament, cowed by Richard's authority, soon declared the children of Edward IV invalid. Nobles who had once pledged loyalty to Edward V now bent the knee to Gloucester, and on June 26, 1483, Richard shed the mask entirely. In Westminster Hall, he accepted the crown of England. He was no longer protector. He was Richard III, King of England. The news spread like fire through London. Some cheered Richard had a reputation as a strong soldier, a man of order in a land weary of Woodville influence. Others fell silent, uneasy at the speed with which the crown had shifted. And still others whispered darkly, if the boy was not king, what would become of him? Inside the tower, Edward and his brother watched the days stretch into weeks. Their tutors dismissed, their attendants gone. They no longer appeared in public, no longer waved to the crowds from the battlements. At first, people asked questions. Then, fewer asked. And finally, the city accepted silence as its answer. Richard III rode in processions, held councils, and dispensed justice, wearing the crown he had claimed. But behind his glittering court, behind the smiles and proclamations, one shadow grew longer with every passing day, the silence of the tower, and the princes who had once lived within it. The boy who had been Edward V was not yet 15, his brother Richard not even 12. Their laughter had once echoed across Ludlow's gardens. Now, only the ravens heard their voices, muffled behind stone. And as rumors multiplied of poison, of daggers, of suffocation in the night, one truth became inescapable. 2 boys had vanished, and a kingdom would never forgive the silence. Summer drifted into autumn, and the Tower of London remained silent. At first, people in the city told themselves the princes were simply being prepared for some new ceremony. Then, they said the boys were ill, kept from view until they recovered. But as the weeks turned into months, hope curdled into dread. The last confirmed sighting came in the summer of 1483. A servant glimpsed the 2 brothers playing in the tower garden, their small figures dwarfed by ancient stone. After that day, no one outside the fortress ever saw them again. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that the boys had been poisoned, their fragile bodies buried beneath flagstones by torchlight. Others spoke of suffocation, of pillows pressed down by hands that trembled only once. Some claimed they had been drowned in a butt of wine, others that they had been spirited away in secret, smuggled to safety in Flanders or Brittany. But the most persistent rumor, the one that stained Richard III's reign like blood on silk, was that he had ordered their deaths himself, the usurper uncle, silencing the only true heirs who stood in his way. Chroniclers painted the scene with grim detail. 2 children awoken in the night, told they must pray, and then quietly dispatched by men loyal to their uncle, their small bodies hidden where no eye could find them. Londoners whispered these stories in alehouses, in market stalls, in hushed voices along the Thames. Mothers told their children to be good, lest they vanish like the princes. Foreign courts gasped in horror, painting Richard as a tyrant who murdered blood for power. Whether true or not, the rumor spread faster than any army. Meanwhile, inside the tower, silence grew absolute. No more games in the garden. No more glimpses from the windows. The chamber that had once held the laughter of princes now held only shadows. And yet, no bodies were found. No grave revealed. No witness ever spoke with certainty. The tower swallowed the boys whole, leaving behind not answers, but questions that would echo for centuries. What truly happened within those stone walls? Were the boys killed on Richard's command, victims of a cold ambition that would stop at nothing? Or were they hidden away, their lives exchanged for secrecy, their names erased to keep them safe? The silence was a void, and into that void poured legend. The boy king, Edward V, and his brother Richard became ghosts. Not merely children lost, but mysteries that would haunt England forever. The disappearance of the princes was like a crack in the very foundation of Richard III's reign. On the surface, the new king wore the crown with confidence. He traveled the realm, presiding over courts of justice, enforcing law where chaos had once reigned. He granted pardons, reduced fines, and tried to project the image of a just ruler. Yet everywhere he went, the question followed him like a shadow. What happened to the boys in the tower? In London, people whispered that the king's smile was carved over a crime. Mothers pulled their children closer when his name was spoken. Chroniclers abroad recorded the scandal with relish. France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire all carried tales of the usurper uncle who murdered his nephews. Whether Richard was guilty or not mattered little. The stain was already indelible. Rebellions soon followed. The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's staunch ally, raised an army against him, citing the prince's disappearance as one of his grievances. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was executed, but the damage was done. The legend of the murdered heirs had given Richard's enemies a weapon far sharper than any sword: moral outrage. And then, across the Channel, a new figure rose: Henry Tudor. A distant Lancastrian claimant, he had spent much of his life in exile, a pawn in foreign courts. But now, with England reeling from whispers of child murder, he found his chance. Henry declared that he would marry Elizabeth of York, the prince's elder sister, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. His banner was not just red, but white and red together, a symbol of peace after decades of blood. By 1485, the kingdom was split. Some still supported Richard, arguing that no proof tied him to the prince's deaths. Others saw Henry Tudor as a savior, the only man who could wash away the stain of the tower. The final reckoning came on a field in Leicestershire, Bosworth, August 22, 1485. Richard III rode into battle with courage that none could deny. He fought like a man possessed, cutting his way toward Henry himself, determined to end the threat with his own sword. But destiny had other plans. Surrounded, betrayed by some of his own allies, Richard fell beneath the blows of Tudor's men. His crown was found in the mud and placed upon Henry's head. Henry VII was king. The Tudor dynasty had begun, and the fate of the princes in the Tower was sealed, not by truth, but by silence. Richard III's enemies painted him forever as the monster who smothered his nephews. Playwrights like Thomas More, chroniclers like Polydore Virgil, and eventually Shakespeare himself turned the story into legend. Richard was remembered as the hunchbacked tyrant, the villain with a crown. The princes became martyrs of innocence, their ghosts haunting the Tower's stones. Yet no body was ever found, no confession ever made. The truth lay buried beneath centuries of suspicion, waiting for archaeologists, centuries later, to dig through bones and shadows. But even then, certainty would remain just out of reach. When Henry VII took the throne, England heaved a sigh of relief. The Wars of the Roses were over, or so it seemed. Yet one mystery clung to the new dynasty like a thorn in its side: the vanished princes. Henry had married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the missing boys, to unite Lancaster and York. Their marriage was celebrated as the healing of a kingdom. But beneath the pageantry, the silence of the Tower remained. Where were the heirs? Had Richard killed them, as everyone believed? Or had Henry, now king, quietly ensured they would never return to challenge him? The uncertainty was fertile ground for pretenders. One man named Lambert Simnel claimed to be Edward Plantagenet, another boy with a Yorkist claim, and raised rebellion in 1487. Later came Perkin Warbeck, who insisted he was Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince. Warbeck's story spread across Europe, winning him allies in Burgundy and Scotland. For years he haunted Henry's reign like a specter of the past, until, finally, he was captured and executed. But even then, many wondered, had he been a fraud, or had one of the princes truly escaped the Tower's grasp? Meanwhile, the Tower itself became a monument to the mystery. Guides whispered to visitors of cries in the night, of small figures in white seen drifting across the battlements. Some swore that on stormy evenings the laughter of children echoed from the stones, then faded into silence. The princes were gone, but their absence had weight, heavier than the crown itself. Centuries passed. Chroniclers painted Richard III as a villain. Shakespeare immortalized him as a deformed tyrant crying, "My kingdom for a horse!" The princes became symbols of innocence, devoured by ambition, their fate a warning carved into the very fabric of English history. Then, in 1674, workmen digging in the Tower uncovered a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of two small children. They were buried in Westminster Abbey under a monument inscribed, "Here lie the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York." Yet even this was no certainty. The bones could not speak, and the truth of their fate remained locked away by centuries. Modern science has tested them, but the results remain inconclusive. The boy who should have been Edward V reigned for barely 3 months. He was never crowned, never ruled, never given the chance to grow into the king he was destined to be. Yet in his absence, he became something greater than a monarch. He became a mystery that England could never solve, a story retold in whispers, in chronicles, in plays and novels. The Tower of London still stands, its stones darkened by centuries of rain. Tourists walk its corridors, gaze at the bloody tower, and ask the same question that haunted London in 1483. What happened to the princes? No answer has ever come, only silence, and the shadows of 2 boys who vanished into legend. History has long painted Richard III in black and crimson, the usurper uncle, the hunchbacked villain who smothered his nephews for a crown. Shakespeare's quill ensured his infamy, crafting a character so monstrous that audiences still hiss his name centuries later. But was Richard truly the murderer of the princes, or merely the perfect scapegoat for a new dynasty eager to blacken its predecessor? The evidence is maddeningly thin. No witness ever confessed to seeing the murders. No proclamation was made. Chroniclers like Thomas More wrote vivid accounts of suffocation in the night, of bodies buried beneath stone steps. But More was writing decades later under the Tudors, rulers who had every reason to demonize Richard. Henry VII's entire legitimacy rested on marrying Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister. If the boys were alive, his claim to the throne was perilous. If they were dead, Richard could be blamed, and Henry could rise as England's savior. Some historians whisper of darker possibilities. Perhaps Richard kept the boys alive, intending to control them, but Henry had them killed after seizing power, erasing the threat they posed to his fragile throne. Perhaps the Woodvilles themselves, desperate to block Richard, tried and failed to hide the princes. Or perhaps the bones found in 1674 belonged not to them at all, but to nameless children swallowed by the tower's long, bloody history. The truth may never be known, yet the mystery itself became more powerful than any fact. Richard III's name was ruined. The Tudors cemented their rule, and the princes became eternal phantoms, symbols of innocence destroyed by ambition, whether by uncle or by king. In the end, the greatest tragedy may not be their deaths, but their silence. Two boys who could not speak for themselves, their story forever told by others, by kings, by enemies, by playwrights. A silence heavy enough to haunt a nation for 500 years. The story of Edward V is not one of kingship, but of absence. He was a child of promise, born into war and crowned too soon, yet remembered not for deeds, but for the silence that swallowed him. His reign, if it can even be called that, lasted scarcely 3 months. He issued no laws, led no armies, won no battles, and yet his shadow is longer than many who wore the crown for decades. The Tower of London, that brooding fortress on the Thames, became his tomb, not of stone and marble, but of mystery. Every stone in its walls seems to carry his ghost, every barred window a reminder of what was lost. Tourists wander its courtyards today, snapping photographs, listening to guides speak of ravens and royalty, but beneath the spectacle lies a silence that no centuries can erase. It is the silence of two boys whose fate was never written down, whose cries were never heard beyond the walls. Richard III's name was broken by that silence. Whether guilty or not, the accusation was enough. The Tudors cemented their dynasty upon it, turning the missing princes into eternal martyrs and their uncle into the perfect villain. Plays, poems, and chronicles have etched the tale into the memory of nations, a story too terrible and too compelling to ever be forgotten. And still, the mystery endures. Were Edward and his brother truly murdered in their sleep? Were they buried in secret, their bones hidden beneath the staircases of the tower? Or did they live on in disguise, their voices silenced not by death but by fear? The bones found in 1674 whisper, but do not speak. Science probes, but offers no final answer. Perhaps that is why Edward V lingers in our imagination, because his story is unfinished. He is not just a boy king who vanished. He is a mirror of power itself, fragile, fleeting, and always hungry to devour the innocent. His crown was not stolen by sword or by law, but by silence. A silence that outlived him, outlived Richard, outlived Henry, and still echoes through the stones of London's darkest tower. In the end, Edward V reminds us of the oldest truth of history, that power does not protect the innocent. It consumes them. And sometimes, it erases them so completely that all we are left with is a question. What happened to the princes in the tower? No one can answer, and perhaps no one ever will.